The winter wind cut through the gaps in the Bennett farmhouse like a knife through canvas. Clara stood at the wash basin, her hands raw and red from scrubbing her uncle's dinner plates in water that had gone cold an hour ago. She was 22 years old, but her hands looked 40, cracked and weathered from years of keeping house for a man who'd never once said thank you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Through the thin walls, she could hear Uncle Silas pacing in the front room. Back and forth, his boots making that familiar rhythm she'd learned to dread. He only paced like that when trouble was coming. Clara dried the last plate and hung the rag on its hook, moving quietly toward the doorway. She'd learned long ago how to make herself invisible in this house, how to read the weather of her uncle's moods before the storm broke. "They'll be here any minute," Silas muttered to himself. His voice carried that particular tremor that meant he was scared. Clara had heard it before, when the crops failed 3 years running, when the bank threatened to foreclose, when her aunt died and left him alone with a niece he'd never wanted. A knock thundered against the front door. Silas flinched so hard he knocked over the whiskey bottle on the side table. Clara watched the amber liquid spread across the wood, dripping onto the floor her aunt had loved, the floor she'd spent 10 years keeping clean in her aunt's memory. "Mr. Bennett." The voice from outside was smooth as butter and twice as slick. "We had an appointment." Silas wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and straightened his vest, though it did nothing to make him look more respectable. He'd been wearing the same clothes for 3 days. When he opened the door, 2 men stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The first was tall and lean, dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than the entire farm. His hat was tilted just so, and his boots, hand-tooled leather, didn't have a speck of mud on them despite the frozen slush outside. The second man was built like a bull, with hands the size of dinner plates and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite with a dull chisel. "Mr. Dalton," Silas said, and Clara heard the defeat in his voice. "Come in, please. I was just—" "Save it." Marcus Dalton removed his hat and placed it on the table with deliberate precision. His eyes swept the room, cataloging everything. The threadbare curtains, the cracked plaster, the empty whiskey bottle. Then his gaze landed on Clara. She felt it like a physical thing, that look. It started at her face and traveled down, assessing, calculating. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear into the walls. Instead, she stood perfectly still, the way rabbits do when they know the hawk has spotted them. "This is your niece?" Dalton asked. "Clara, yes." "Clara, get back to the kitchen. This is business." But Dalton raised one hand. "No, let her stay. This concerns her." The room went very cold, colder than the winter wind outside. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs. Silas laughed, but it came out strangled. "Now, Marcus, we can work this out between men." "There's no need to. You owe me $12,000, Silas." Dalton's voice never rose above conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying. "The poker games at my establishment. The cattle you bought on credit and never paid for. The loan I extended to you last spring with the understanding it would be repaid by harvest. The harvest failed, you know that. Everyone's harvest failed. Everyone else found a way to pay their debts." Dalton walked slowly around the room, his fingers trailing along the furniture. "Everyone else worked extra, sold their possessions, made sacrifices, but you? You drank my whiskey, played my tables, and acted like money was air." Clara's mouth went dry. $12,000. That was more money than she'd seen in her entire life. "I can get it," Silas said desperately. "Give me until spring. I'll plant wheat instead of corn. This farm isn't worth $3,000, and we both know it." Dalton stopped in front of the fireplace. where a single framed photograph sat on the mantel. Clara's parents, dead now 15 years. "I'm a businessman, Silas. I take payment in whatever form it comes." The silence that followed was so thick Clara could hardly breathe through it. "What are you saying?" Silas whispered. Dalton turned to look at Clara again, and this time his smile was slow and cold. "I'm saying I'll forgive your debt. Every penny. You can keep this worthless farm, drink yourself to death in peace. All you have to do is sign a contract." "What kind of contract?" From his jacket, Dalton produced a folded document. He laid it on the table and smoothed it flat with one pale hand. Clara couldn't read it from where she stood, but she could see Silas's face go white as he bent over it. "No," Silas said. "Absolutely not. I won't." Dalton's eyebrows rose. "Then I'll have my associate here break both your legs. After that, we'll burn this house to the ground with you in it. Your niece can watch. Then I'll sell her anyway to recoup my losses, and she'll go to someone far less civilized than me." The big man by the door cracked his knuckles. Clara found her voice. "What does the contract say?" "Clara, be quiet," Silas snapped. But Dalton smiled at her, the way a cat might smile at a mouse. "Smart girl, the contract says you belong to me now. You'll work at my ranch, the Copper Creek Spread, finest cattle operation in Wyoming. You'll have a roof over your head, 3 meals a day, proper clothes, and in exchange, your uncle's debt disappears." "Work as what?" Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Whatever I need. Cook, laundress, ranch hand. I'm not unreasonable." "For how long?" "Until I decide the debt is paid." Dalton pulled out a pen and set it beside the contract. "Or until you die. Whichever comes first." Clara looked at her uncle. For 15 years, she'd kept his house, cooked his meals, mended his clothes, and asked for nothing in return except a place to sleep and enough food to survive. And now he stood there, staring at that contract, actually considering it. "Uncle Silas," she said quietly. "Don't." But she could see it in his eyes. He was going to sign. His hand trembled as he picked up the pen. "You promise the debt is cleared? All of it? Every red cent? And you won't hurt her?" Dalton laughed. "I'm not a monster, Silas. I'm a businessman." The pen scratched across the paper. 3 signatures: Silas Bennett, Marcus Dalton, and the witness signature of the big man, who Clara later learned was named Pike. When it was done, Dalton folded the contract and tucked it back into his jacket. "Pleasure doing business. Pike, help Miss Bennett gather her things. We leave in 10 minutes." Clara stood frozen as Pike moved toward her. This couldn't be happening. People didn't get sold anymore. Not in 1883, not in America. There were laws against this, but there were also debts, and men like Marcus Dalton who knew how to use them. "Wait," Clara said. "I need to—" "10 minutes," Dalton repeated. "Or you leave with nothing but what you're wearing." She ran to the tiny room she'd occupied for 15 years. Her hands shook as she threw her few possessions into a canvas bag: 2 dresses, a hairbrush that had been her mother's, a book of poetry she'd read so many times the spine was broken. There was a photograph of her parents she wanted, but it was on the mantel downstairs. When she came back down, Silas wouldn't look at her. He stood by the window, staring out at nothing. "Uncle Silas," she tried one more time. "It's for the best," he said, and his voice was hollow. "You'll have a better life at Copper Creek than here. I'm family. You're a mouth to feed I can't afford." Finally he turned to face her, and his eyes were wet but hard. "Your father left you to me when he died, and I did my duty. Now it's time you did yours." Clara felt something break inside her chest, some small, stubborn hope she'd been carrying that underneath it all, her uncle cared. But there was nothing in his face except relief that his debt was paid. Dalton opened the door. The wagon's waiting. The cold hit Clara like a wall. Outside, a covered wagon stood in the yard, pulled by 2 huge draft horses. Pike climbed up onto the driver's seat while Dalton gestured for Clara to get in the back. She climbed up, her bag clutched to her chest. As Pike snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, Clara looked back at the farmhouse. It was a poor, broken-down place, but it was the only home she remembered. Uncle Silas stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the lamplight. He didn't wave. The wagon turned onto the main road, and the farmhouse disappeared behind them. Clara pulled her thin shawl tighter against the wind and tried not to cry. She wouldn't give Dalton the satisfaction, but as the miles rolled by and the night grew darker, Clara allowed herself one small, desperate thought. Somewhere in this cold Wyoming night, was there anyone who might care that she'd been sold like cattle? Anyone who might think it was wrong? Anyone who might try to stop it? The wagon rolled through the darkness for what felt like hours. Clara sat in the back, wedged between crates of supplies and coils of rope that smelled like tar and leather. Every rut in the frozen road sent jarring shocks through her spine, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too busy trying to process what had just happened. She'd been sold, like a horse, like furniture through the canvas opening at the back of the wagon. She could see the road disappearing behind them, a ribbon of gray in the moonlight. The farmhouse was miles behind now, and with every passing moment, escape seemed more impossible. Up front, she could hear Pike and Dalton talking in low voices, though she couldn't make out the words. Occasionally, Dalton's cold laugh would drift back to her, and it made her skin crawl. They'd been traveling for nearly 2 hours when the wagon suddenly slowed. Clara sat up straighter, her heart beginning to pound. Through a gap in the canvas, she could see they were passing through a small settlement, hardly even a town, just a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads. A general store, a blacksmith's forge gone dark for the night, and a saloon with yellow lights spilling from its windows. The wagon stopped. "What are we doing?" Clara heard herself ask. Dalton appeared at the back of the wagon, his face half shadowed in the lamplight from the saloon. "Pike needs whiskey for the rest of the journey. We'll be here 15 minutes. Don't try to run. There's nowhere to go, and Pike is faster than he looks." He disappeared toward the saloon, Pike following like a massive shadow. Clara sat in the darkness, her mind racing. 15 minutes. Could she run? Where would she go? It was December in Wyoming, below freezing, and she had nowhere to miss. The voice came from right beside the wagon, so quiet she almost missed it. Clara's head snapped around. A man stood in the shadows between the wagon and the general store. She could barely make him out, tall, lean, wearing a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. But his eyes caught the moonlight, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Don't make a sound," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is James Holloway. I saw what happened at your uncle's farm." Clara's throat went dry. "You followed us?" "I was there when Dalton made that deal. I worked for him until 3 days ago." He moved closer, keeping one eye on the saloon door. "I know what he does to the people he owns. You need to understand what you're walking into. Tell me quickly." James glanced at the saloon again, then back at her. In the better light, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 30, with a weathered face and a scar along his jawline that disappeared into his collar. "Dalton runs Copper Creek like a prison. The people who work there aren't employees, they're trapped. Debt contracts, just like yours. Some of them have been there 10 years, and he keeps finding reasons why their debt isn't paid." Clara felt ice forming in her stomach. "What happened 3 days ago? Why did you leave?" "I found out what he does to the women." James's voice went hard. "There's a woman there now, Margaret Porter. She came on a contract 2 years ago. Dalton keeps her locked in the main house. He doesn't treat her like a worker." The implication hit Clara like a fist. "I need to get away from here, right now." "Not yet. If you run now, Pike will catch you before you make it 50 yards. Dalton will punish you, and he'll make sure you never get another chance." James pulled something from his coat, a small piece of paper. "This is a map to my camp. It's 15 miles northwest of Copper Creek, in the foothills. There's an old line shack marked with a red cloth on the door. Why are you helping me?" "Because I should have helped Margaret, and I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my business." His jaw tightened. "I'm not making that mistake again." The saloon door banged open. Dalton's laugh rang out across the cold air. "There. Coming," Clara whispered urgently. "What do I do?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Go with them. Don't fight. Don't give him any reason to watch you closer. Learn the layout of the ranch. Figure out where the horses are kept. In 3 days, there's a cattle auction. Half the ranch hands will be gone, including Pike. That's when you run. Can you ride? Yes. Then ride hard for my camp. I'll be waiting. He pressed the paper into her hand. Don't let anyone see that map. Wait, why 3 days? Why not help me escape sooner? James met her eyes, and she saw something there that was equal parts guilt and determination. Because I need those 3 days to prepare, to make sure when you run, Dalton can't follow. Trust me in this, Clara. Clara Bennett. Trust me, Clara. 3 days, and I'll get you out of this. I promise. He melted back into the shadows just as Pike rounded the corner of the wagon, a bottle in each massive hand. The big man peered into the darkness where James had been standing. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. Thought I heard voices, Pike rumbled. Clara's. Heart hammered so hard she was sure he could hear it. Just me. I was praying. Pike snorted. Lot of good that'll do you. He climbed up onto the driver's seat as Dalton emerged from the saloon, a fresh cigar between his teeth. All set? Dalton asked pleasantly, as if they were on a Sunday outing. Ready, boss. The wagon lurched forward again. Clara clutched the paper in her fist, careful to keep it hidden in the folds of her skirt. 3 days. She just had to survive 3 days. As they left the settlement behind, Clara risked a glance back. In the shadows near the general store, she thought she saw a figure on horseback, watching them go. Then the darkness swallowed everything, and they were alone again on the frozen road. The remaining journey passed in a blur of cold and fear. Clara tried to memorize landmarks: a lightning-struck pine tree, a creek bed, a rocky outcrop that looked like a giant's tooth. Anything that might help her find her way back if she needed to run before 3 days were up. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached Copper Creek Ranch. Clara had expected something grand, given Dalton's obvious wealth, but what she saw made her stomach sink. The main house was large, yes, but it was surrounded by a high fence with gates that Pike had to unlock. Beyond it, she could see a cluster of smaller buildings, bunkhouses she guessed, and further out, the cattle pens and barns. It looked less like a ranch and more like a fortress. Pike drove them through the gates, which he locked again behind them. Clara noticed there were men posted at various points around the property, even at this early hour. Guards, she realized with growing dread. James had been right. This was a prison. The wagon stopped in front of the main house. Dalton jumped down and stretched, apparently unconcerned by the night of travel. Welcome to your new home, Clara. Pike, take her to the women's quarters. Mrs. Harriet will get her sorted out. A woman appeared on the porch, short, round, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was deeply lined, and her eyes held the kind of wariness Clara had seen in beaten dogs. Another one? Mrs. Harriet said, and there was no surprise in her voice, only resignation. This is Clara Bennett. She be working in the house. Make sure she understands the rules. Dalton pulled out his pocket watch and checked it. I need to sleep. Wake me at noon. He disappeared inside, leaving Clara standing in the frozen yard. with Pike looming behind her and Mrs. Harriet studying her from the porch. "Come on then," the older woman said finally. "Let's get you fed and situated. You look half frozen." Clara followed her around the side of the main house to a smaller structure, little more than a shed really, with a stove pipe poking through the roof. Inside, it was divided into tiny compartments, each with a narrow cot and a trunk. 3 other women were already awake, getting dressed in identical gray dresses. They all stopped and stared when Clara entered. "This is Clara," Mrs. Harriet announced. "She be taking Martha's old space." She pointed to an empty compartment at the end. "The rules are simple. Up at 5, work until dark, no talking to the ranch hands, no going near the gates, no leaving the property. Break the rules, and Mr. Dalton decides your punishment. Understand?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good. Get changed. There's a dress in the trunk. Breakfast is in 10 minutes, and then you start work." Mrs. Harriet paused. At the door, "A word of advice, girl. Don't make trouble. The ones who make trouble don't last long here." She left, and Clara was alone with the 3 other women, who were still staring at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. The youngest one, a girl who couldn't have been more than 18, stepped forward. "I'm Ruth," she said softly. "That's Alice and Dorothea. Don't mind Mrs. Harriet. She's hard, but she's not cruel. Not like some. How long have you been here?" Clara asked. Ruth's face closed up. 2 years. But we don't talk about that. We don't talk about much of anything, really. It's safer that way." Clara changed into the gray dress, which was too big in the shoulders and too short in the hem. The whole time, she could feel the folded map pressing against her skin, hidden in her undergarments where no one would find it. 3 days, James had said. 3 days until the cattle auction, until half the guards were gone, until she had her chance. She just had to stay invisible until then. She just had to survive. As she followed the other women to breakfast, Clara looked up at the main house. Somewhere in there, Margaret Porter was trapped. Somewhere beyond those fences, James Holloway was preparing to help her escape. And somewhere inside herself, Clara found a spark of something she hadn't felt in years, hope mixed with defiance. She'd been sold, yes, but she hadn't given up. Not yet. Clara's first full day at Copper Creek began before dawn with the clang of a bell that jerked her from uneasy sleep. Around her, the other women moved like ghosts, dressing silently in the gray half-light that filtered through the single window. Breakfast was thin porridge and bitter coffee served in a drafty kitchen house separate from the main building. Clara counted 15 workers total, the 4 women from her quarters, Mrs. Harriet, and 10 men who ate at a different table and never once looked in their direction. They all had the same hollow-eyed look, the same defeated slump to their shoulders. "You'll work with me today," Mrs. Harriet told Clara as they finished eating. "Laundry and mending. Later, if you prove useful, you might get moved to kitchen duty. That's easier on the hands." The laundry house was a stone building behind the main house, with huge copper tubs and a fireplace that never seemed to produce enough heat. Alice was already there, feeding wood into the flames. "Start with the linens," Mrs. Harriet instructed, pointing to a mountain of sheets and towels. "They need to be scrubbed, wrung out, and hung to dry before noon. Then we start on Mr. Dalton's personal items." For the next 4 hours, Clara scrubbed until her hands were raw and her back screamed in protest. The water was scalding at first, then quickly turned gray and cold. Every sheet had to be beaten against the washboard, wrung out with aching arms, and carried outside to hang on lines stretched between posts. Alice worked beside her in silence. But Clara noticed the younger woman kept glancing at her with something like concern. "You don't have to be afraid of me," Clara said quietly when Mrs. Harriet stepped outside. "I'm not afraid of you," Alice replied. She was perhaps 40, with the kind of severe face that might have been pretty once. "I'm afraid for you." The new Ones always think they can find a way out, and they can't. Alice's hands stilled in the wash water. There was a man last year, Thomas Crawford. He tried to escape during a supply run to town. They caught him before he made it 2 miles. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. Dalton had Pike break both his legs. Made us all watch. Thomas is still here, works in the stables. He limps now, and he'll never walk right again. The message was clear. Escape attempts ended in suffering. But Clara thought of the map hidden in her clothes, of James Holloway waiting in the foothills. And she kept scrubbing. Around midday, Mrs. Harriet sent Clara to deliver fresh linens to the main house. "Third door on the left upstairs," she said. "Don't linger, don't look around, and for God's sake, don't speak unless spoken to." Clara climbed the back stairs with her arms full of folded sheets. The main house was as cold inside as it was imposing outside, all dark wood and heavy furniture. That seemed designed to make a person feel small. Portraits of stern-faced men lined the walls, probably Dalton's ancestors, all of them looking like they'd never smiled a day in their lives. She found the third door and knocked softly. "Come in," a woman's voice called. Clara pushed the door open and froze. The room was clearly meant to be a guest bedroom, but it had been transformed into something else entirely. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light. A vanity table held bottles of perfume and powder. And on the bed, wearing a silk robe that must have cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe, sat a woman with auburn hair and empty eyes, Margaret Porter. "You're new," Margaret said, and her voice had a dreamy quality, as if she were speaking from very far away. "What's your name?" "Clara Bennett, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am. I'm not that old." Margaret stood and walked to the window, moving carefully like someone who'd been injured and hadn't quite healed. "How did Dalton get you?" "My uncle's debt." "They're always debts, aren't they?" Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mine was my father's. He borrowed money to expand his store and couldn't pay it back. Dalton offered to forgive everything if I came to work here for 2 years. She turned to face Clara, and the emptiness in her eyes was terrifying. "That was 3 years ago. He keeps finding reasons why my debt hasn't been properly settled." Clara set the linens down on a chair. "James Holloway told me about you." The change in Margaret was instant. Her eyes sharpened, and real emotion flickered. Across her face for the first time fear mixed with desperate hope. "James? You've seen James? The night I was brought here. He stopped the wagon at a crossroads. Told me he used to work here. He's alive." Margaret's hand went to her mouth. "Thank God. I thought Dalton had killed him when he left. He said he would." "What happened between them?" Margaret glanced at the door, then moved closer, lowering her voice. "James worked here for 2 years. He was one of the ranch hand's best horsemen Dalton ever had. But 3 months ago, Dalton decided." She paused, struggling with the words. "He decided I should be more than just a housekeeper." James tried to stop it. He confronted Dalton, said what he was doing was illegal, immoral. Dalton had Pike beat him unconscious and throw him off the property. Told him if he ever came back, he'd kill him. Clara's stomach churned. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be careful." Margaret gripped Clara's arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "Whatever James told you, whatever plan you two have, Dalton will find out. He always finds out. He has eyes everywhere. The ranch hands report to him. Mrs. Harriet reports to him. Even some of the other workers are informants. You can't trust anyone here. Can I trust you?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "I don't know anymore. What would you do to be free, Clara? Would you betray someone else? Because that's the choice Dalton forces on people. He makes you complicit in your own captivity." Before Clara could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that could only belong to one person. "Hide those sheets and sit down," Margaret hissed. "Pretend we're just talking." Clara barely had time to shove the linens behind the chair, before the door opened without a knock. Marcus. Dalton filled the doorway, and in the daylight, he looked even more predatory than he had the night before. His suit was immaculate, his hair perfectly combed, his smile sharp as a razor. "Margaret, my dear, I see you have company." His eyes slid to Clara. "Miss Bennet, I trust you're settling in well." "Yes, sir," Clara forced herself to say. "Good. Good. I like to make sure all my workers are comfortable." He walked into the room and stood between them, close enough that Clara could smell his cologne, something expensive and cloying. "Margaret, we're having guests tonight. Some business associates from Denver. I'll need you to look presentable." "Of course," Margaret said, and her voice had gone flat again. Dalton turned his full attention to Clara. "You know, you're prettier than your uncle led me to believe. He made you sound like a drudge, all work and no appeal. But I can see potential in you." Every instinct Clara had screamed at her to run, but she stood frozen as Dalton reached out and touched her cheek with one finger. His skin was cold. "Sir, I should get back to the laundry," she managed. "Should you?" Dalton's smile widened. "Well, we can't have Mrs. Harriet angry, can we?" "Run along then, Clara. But remember, everyone here belongs to me. That means you belong to me. Every part of you." Clara fled. She heard Margaret say something behind her, heard Dalton's low laugh, but she didn't stop until she was back in the laundry house with the door closed behind her. Mrs. Harriet took one look at her face and said nothing. Alice handed her a sheet to wring out, and Clara threw herself into the work, trying to wash away the feeling of Dalton's finger on her skin. That evening, Clara learned more about the rhythm of Copper Creek. The workers ate dinner in shifts, men first, then women. Afterward, there was an hour before lights out where they were allowed in their quarters, but nowhere else. The gates remained locked. Guards patrolled the perimeter. And through it all, the main house blazed with light as Dalton entertained his guests. Ruth sat on her cot, mending a torn apron. Dorothea was already asleep, exhausted from working in the kitchens all day. Alice had a book, a battered copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, and was reading by candlelight. Clara pulled out the map James had given her and studied it carefully, memorizing every detail, the route northwest to the foothills. The landmarks, too. Watch for the location of the line shack with the red cloth. "What's that?" Ruth asked. Clara quickly folded it. "Nothing. Just something from home." Ruth looked at her for a long moment, and Clara saw the same hollow acceptance in her eyes that she'd seen in everyone else at Copper Creek. "Everyone who comes here brings something from home," Ruth said finally. "Something to remind them of who they used to be. But eventually, you'll throw it away. It hurts too much to remember." "I won't forget," Clara said. "That's what I said too." Ruth went back to her mending. 2 years ago, I said that exact thing. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance. Guards calling to each other as they changed shifts. And from the main house, the faint sound of piano music and laughter. She touched the map hidden under her thin mattress and thought of James Holloway, somewhere in the darkness beyond the fences. 2 more days until the cattle auction. 2 more days until her chance came. She just had to survive 2 more days without Dalton, deciding she was more useful to him in the main house than in the laundry. 2 days, and she would either be free or dead. There wasn't much difference between the two anymore. The second day dawned gray and bitter. With clouds hanging so low, Clara thought she could reach up and touch them. Mrs. Harriet assigned her to the kitchens, a promotion, apparently, though it meant working alongside Dorothea under the watchful eye of the head cook, a massive woman named Ingrid, who ran her domain with the efficiency of a military commander. "You chop vegetables," Ingrid barked, shoving a knife and a bushel of turnips at Clara. "No talking, no dawdling, no burning yourself on my stoves. If you're useful, you stay. If you're not, you go back to laundry." The kitchen was at least warm, which was more than could be said for most places at Copper Creek. Clara worked at a scarred wooden table near the window, chopping turnips into precise cubes while Dorothea kneaded bread dough nearby. Through the window, she could see the main yard where ranch hands were loading supplies onto wagons. "That's for the auction tomorrow," Dorothea said quietly, following Clara's gaze. "They'll take about 15 men with them. Gone for 2 days, maybe 3 if the bidding goes well." Clara's pulse quickened. Tomorrow. Her chance would come tomorrow. "Do they always take that many?" she asked, keeping her voice casual. "Usually. Dalton likes to make a show of it, demonstrates his wealth, his cattle, his power." Dorothea's hands worked the dough with practiced rhythm. "Last year, Pike stayed behind to watch over things. This year, ... double quotes, she trailed off, glancing toward the door. "This year what?" But Dorothea had already gone quiet, her attention fixed on her work with sudden intensity. A moment later, Clara understood why. One of the ranch hands had entered the kitchen, a consultant. Lean man with a scarred face and cold eyes that swept the room like he was cataloging everything. Clara recognized him from breakfast. He'd been sitting at the far end of the men's table, watching everyone. "Ingrid," he said, "Mr. Dalton wants dinner an hour early tonight. Some business to attend to before bed." "Fine," Ingrid grunted. "Tell him it'll be steak and potatoes." The man's eyes lingered on Clara for a moment longer than necessary before he left. When the door closed behind him, Clara felt like she could breathe again. "That's Vernon Hayes," Dorothea whispered. "He's Dalton's favorite. Reports everything. He sees and hears. Don't say anything around him you wouldn't say directly to Dalton." Clara filed that information away. Margaret had been right, informants were everywhere. The morning passed in a blur of chopping, stirring, and trying to stay out of Ingrid's way. Around noon, Mrs. Harriet appeared with a covered basket. "Clara, you'll take Mr. Dalton's lunch to his office. 3rd door on the right, downstairs. Knock twice and wait for permission to enter." Clara's stomach dropped, but she took the basket without argument. Inside, she could smell roasted chicken and fresh bread. Far better fare than the workers ever saw. The main house felt different during the day. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, but it only seemed to emphasize how cold and empty the place was. Clara found the 3rd door and knocked twice, her heart hammering. "Enter." Dalton's office was all dark leather and polished wood, with a massive desk covered in papers and ledgers. He sat behind it like a king on a throne, reviewing what looked like financial documents. Pike stood in the corner like a stone statue, his arms crossed. Lunch. Excellent." Dalton gestured to a side table. "Set it there, Clara." She did, her hands steady despite her nerves. She was about to leave when Dalton spoke again. "Wait, I have something for you." He opened a drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a revised contract. Your uncle's original agreement had you working off his debt through labor, but I've had time to review the numbers. At the rate you're working, it would take you approximately 18 years to settle $12,000. Clara's blood went cold. 18 years? Give or take. Of course there's another option. Dalton's smile was predatory. If you were to agree to more specialized duties, the debt could be cleared much faster. 5 years, perhaps. Maybe less if you're particularly talented. The implication was crystal clear. Clara looked at Pike, but the big man's face showed nothing. He might as well have been deaf for all the reaction he gave. "I'll stick with the original arrangement," Clara said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "Suit yourself, but the offer stands." Dalton waved his hand dismissively. "You may go." Clara fled the office, her mind reeling. 18 years. She'd be 40 years old before she earned her freedom, assuming Dalton didn't simply extend the contract indefinitely like he'd done with Margaret. She had to escape tomorrow. There was no other option. That afternoon, As Clara was returning to the kitchen from the root cellar with more vegetables, she nearly collided with someone coming around the corner of the building. Sorry, she stopped short. It was Thomas Crawford, the man Alice had mentioned. The one who'd tried to escape and paid for it with shattered legs. He leaned heavily on a crutch, and even standing still, Clara could see the pain etched into every line of his face. "You're Clara," he said. It wasn't a question. The new one. Yes. Thomas glanced around, checking they were alone. "I need to talk to you, not here. Tonight, after dinner, there's a barn at the far end of the property. The one with the broken door. Meet me there. Why should I trust you? Because I know what you're planning, and I'm trying to save your life." His eyes were intense, urgent. "James Holloway sent me a message. But there's something he doesn't know, something you need to hear before tomorrow." Clara's throat went dry. "How do I know this isn't a trap?" "You don't. But if it is, what do you lose? You're trapped here anyway." Thomas shifted his weight, and Clara saw him wince. 9 o'clock. Don't be late." He limped away before she could respond. The rest of the day dragged interminably. Clara helped serve the early dinner to Dalton and his associates, businessmen from Denver who talked about cattle prices and railway expansion while drinking expensive brandy. She kept her eyes down, moved quietly, and tried to be invisible. Afterward, during the brief free hour before lights out, Clara told Ruth she needed to use the privy and slipped out into the dark. The barn Thomas had mentioned was at the very edge of the property, almost against the fence. Clara could see the guards' lanterns bobbing in the distance, but they were far enough away that she felt reasonably safe as she slipped through the broken door. Inside, it smelled of hay and horses. A single lamp burned low, casting long shadows. Thomas stood near an empty stall, his crutch propped against the wall beside him. "You came," he said. "Good, we don't have much time. What did you need to tell me?" Thomas pulled something from his pocket, a crumpled piece of paper. "James sent this with one of the supply drivers. He's been watching the ranch, making plans for your escape. But there's a problem." He handed her the paper. In rough handwriting. It said, "Vernon Hayes is planning something. Heard him talking to Dalton about tightening security during the auction. They suspect someone might try to run. Be careful." Clara's stomach plummeted. "Vernon knows?" "Not about you specifically, but Dalton's paranoid. He always gets this way before the auction, worried that workers will take advantage of the reduced guard." Thomas took the paper back and held it to the lamp flame, watching it burn. "James wants you to know the plan is still on, but you'll need to be smarter about it. Don't go for the horses in the main stable. They'll be watched. There's a old Mari in the south pasture, beyond the cattle pens. She's half lame, but she'll get you to the foothills if you're not pushed too hard." "How will I get past the fence?" "There's a section on the west side, near the creek. The post is rotted through at the base. You can push it over if you use your weight right. I would have used it myself if Pike hadn't caught me first." His voice went bitter. "Once you're over, head northwest. James will find you." Clara studied his face in the lamplight. "Why are you helping me? What do you get out of this?" "Nothing. Absolutely nothing." Thomas picked up his crutch and tested his weight on his damaged legs. "But maybe if you make it out, it'll prove it's possible. Maybe it'll give the rest of us hope. Or maybe I just want to cause Dalton one month of frustration, one loss he can't control." He moved toward the door. "Go back separately. Wait 5 minutes after I leave." "Thomas," Clara called as he reached the door. "Thank you." He paused, his back to her. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me if you survive." Then he was gone, limping into the darkness. Clara waited the 5 minutes, though each second felt like an hour. When she finally slipped out of the barn, the night was quiet except for the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of the windmill by the main house. She made it back to the women's quarters without incident. Ruth was already asleep, and Alice. didn't look up from her book. Clara changed into her nightgown and climbed onto her cot, her mind racing. Tomorrow, the auction party would leave at dawn. Vernon would be watching, but so would Thomas, and somewhere beyond the fences, James Holloway was waiting. She touched the map hidden under her mattress one more time, memorizing the route for the 100th time. Northwest to the foothills. Lined shack with the red cloth. Freedom, or something close to it. As she finally drifted towards sleep, Clara's last conscious thought was a prayer, not for divine intervention, but for courage. The courage to push over that fence post. The courage to ride into the unknown. The courage to believe that somewhere in the Wyoming wilderness, a cowboy she'd met for 5 minutes in the darkness was actually telling the truth. Because if he wasn't, tomorrow night she'd either be dead or wishing she was. One more day until she found out which. Clara woke to chaos. The 5 o'clock bell hadn't rung yet, but outside the women's quarters, she could hear shouting, the thunder of hooves, and wagons being loaded. The auction party was preparing to leave. She dressed quickly in the gray work dress, her fingers trembling as she buttoned it. Today. Everything depended on today. In the kitchen, Ingrid was already barking orders. Breakfast needs to be ready in 20 minutes. The men leave at dawn, and Mr. Dalton wants them fed properly. Move, Clara threw herself into the work, frying eggs, slicing bread, pouring coffee into tin cups that would be loaded onto the wagons. Through the kitchen window, she watched the preparations unfold. 15 ranch hands, just as Dorothea had predicted, checking weapons and securing cargo. The cattle had been moved to holding pens near the main gate, ready to be driven to the auction grounds 30 miles south. And there, supervising everything with his usual cold efficiency, was Pike. Clara's heart sank. She'd hoped he would go with the auction party, but apparently Dalton wanted his enforcer here to maintain control. Vernon Hayes was going, though. Clara watched him mount a gray stallion and ride toward the front of the convoy. Small mercies, Dalton appeared on the main house porch, dressed in an expensive coat and carrying a leather portfolio. He surveyed his operation with obvious satisfaction, then mounted his own horse, a magnificent black gelding that probably cost more than most men earned in 5 years. Listen up. Dalton's voice carried across the yard. We'll be gone 2 days. 3 at most. Pike is in charge. Anyone who gives him trouble answers to me when I get back. And I won't be nearly as gentle as Pike. He smiled, and even from the kitchen window, Clara could see how the workers flinched. Let's move out. The gates swung open, and the convoy rolled through. Clara watched until the last wagon disappeared down the road and the gates clanged shut again. The ranch suddenly felt emptier, quieter, but also more oppressive. Pike stood in the center of the yard, his massive arms crossed, surveying his temporary kingdom. Only 5 guards remained posted around the property. The odds had just gotten marginally better. Stop gawking and finish those dishes, Ingrid snapped. Just because half the men are gone doesn't mean the work stops. The morning dragged. Clara washed dishes, scrubbed floors, and helped Dorothea prepare lunch for the skeleton crew that remained. Every task felt surreal, like she was moving through a dream, because in her mind she was already running, already pushing over that fence post, already riding northwest toward freedom. Around midday, Mrs. Harriet found her in the root cellar. Pike wants to see you. Main house, his office. Clara's blood turned to ice. Why? He doesn't explain himself to me, and I don't ask. Oh, now. Pike's office was smaller than Dalton's, but somehow more menacing, all weapons and tools of violence displayed on the walls like trophies. Pike sat behind a desk that looked comically small beneath his bulk, cleaning a knife. Clara Bennett, he said without looking up. Sit. She sat in the hard wooden chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap to hide their shaking. Pike tested the knife's edge with his thumb, then set it down. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were like chips of flint. I've been watching. You, sir? You're different from the others. Most new workers spend the first week crying, begging, trying to bargain. You haven't done any of that. You've been quiet, obedient, invisible." He leaned forward. "That makes me suspicious." "I'm just trying to do my work, sir. Are you?" Pike picked up the knife again, turning it slowly so it caught the light. "Because Thomas Crawford was quiet too, right up until the night he tried to run. And I remember he spent time in the South Barn, just like you did last night." Clara's heart stopped. He knew. He'd seen her meeting with Thomas. "I was using the privy," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I got lost coming back in the dark. The South Barn is half a mile from the privy. I told you I got lost. The ranch is confusing at night." Pike studied her for a long moment that felt like an eternity. Then he stood, walking around the desk, to stand directly in front of her. He was so close she could smell gun oil and tobacco on him. "I'm going to tell you something, Clara. Something I want you to remember every second of every day you're here." He bent down until his face was level with hers. "I've broken every bone in the human body at one time or another. Some people, I've broken the same bone twice. And I never get tired of my work. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Now get back to the kitchen, and stay where I can see you." Clara left on shaking legs. As she crossed the yard back to the kitchen, she felt Pike's eyes on her every step of the way. He suspected. He didn't have proof, but he suspected, and that made tonight infinitely more dangerous. In the kitchen, Dorothea took one look at Clara's face and pressed a cup of water into her hands. "What did he say?" "He knows I met with Thomas, Jesus." Dorothea glanced toward the window, where Pike's office was visible across the yard. "Clara, whatever you're planning, I'm not planning anything. Don't lie to me. I've been here for years. I know the signs." Dorothea's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "If you're going to run, do it tonight. Pike is suspicious now, but he doesn't know for certain. By tomorrow he'll have proof, or he'll manufacture it. Tonight is your only chance. What about you? And Ruth? And Alice?" Dorothea's smile was sad. "We're already broken, Clara, but you're not yet. So when you go, don't look back. Don't hesitate. Don't let guilt stop you. Just run." The afternoon passed in agonizing slowness. Clara helped prepare dinner, served it to Pike and the remaining guards, and cleaned up afterward. Every movement was watched. Every step was tracked. Pike had positioned himself where he could see the entire compound, and his eyes followed her constantly. Sunset came at 5:30, painting the snow-covered mountains gold and crimson. Clara watched it from the kitchen window and thought, "This is either the last sunset I'll see as a prisoner, or the last sunset I'll ever see." After dinner, during the brief free hour, Clara returned to the women's quarters. Ruth was mending again, her needle flashing in the lamplight. Alice was already in bed, her book open but unread on her chest. And Dorothea sat on her cot, watching Clara with knowing eyes. Clara changed into her nightgown, but underneath it, she kept on her chemise and bloomers. She hid her shoes under her cot, where she could reach them quickly. The map was already memorized, so she'd burned it hours ago. Everything she owned that mattered, her mother's hairbrush, her father's photograph, was in a small bundle under her pillow. At 9 o'clock, Mrs. Harriet came through for bed check, counted heads, and locked the door from the outside. They were trapped until morning. Clara waited. She listened to Ruth's breathing slow and deepen. She watched Alice turn over and go still. She counted the guard rotations she could hear through the thin walls. Every hour, footsteps crunching. Through frost, voices calling, "All clear." At midnight, the ranch finally went quiet. The main house went dark. The last guard rotation passed, and then there was only silence and starlight. Clara slipped out of bed and dressed in her gray work dress over her undergarments. She pulled on her shoes, grabbed her bundle, and moved to the window. It was small, barely large enough for a child, but Clara was thin from years of hard work. She'd already checked it the first night. The latch was broken, and it opened with barely a creak. She squeezed through, dropping silently to the frozen ground outside. Women's quarters were at the back of the compound, farthest from the main gate. That was good. Clara stayed low, moving from shadow to shadow, using every skill she'd learned hunting rabbits as a child on her father's farm. The night was bitterly cold, and her breath came in white clouds, but she didn't dare stop. She passed the kitchen, house, the laundry, the main barn where the good horses were kept and where a guard was posted, just as Thomas had warned. She gave it wide berth, circling around through the cattle pens. The cattle shifted and lowed softly as she passed, but they didn't raise an alarm. Beyond them, she could see the south pasture, and there, grazing alone in the moonlight, was the old mare Thomas had described. Clara climbed the fence rail and dropped into the pasture. The mare lifted her head, watching Clara approach with dark, intelligent eyes. She was old, with a pronounced limp in her left hind leg, but she didn't shy away when Clara reached for her halter. "Easy, girl," Clara whispered. "We're going to help each other tonight." Using the fence rail as a mounting block, Clara pulled herself onto the mare's bare back. No saddle, no reins, just her hands twisted in the mare's mane and her legs gripping tight. They moved toward the west fence line, where the creek ran through the property. Clara counted fence posts in the darkness. 7, 8, 9. There, the 10th post leaned at an angle, its base dark with rot. Clara dismounted it and pressed her shoulder against it. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of splintering wood, the post gave way, taking 2 sections of fence with it. A gap, just barely large enough for a horse to squeeze through. Clara was remounting when she heard it. Footsteps, running, and then a voice that made her blood freeze. "Stop right there!" She kicked the mare's sides hard. The old horse lurched forward, through the gap in the fence, out onto the open range beyond. Behind her, she heard Pike's roar. "She's running! Sound the alarm!" A bell began to clang, shattering the night's silence. Lights bloomed in windows across the compound. Men were shouting, dogs were barking, and above it all, Clara heard the thunder of horses being saddled and brought out. They were coming after her. She leaned low over the mares neck and urged her faster, northwest toward the dark line of foothills, toward James Holloway and whatever freedom he promised. But behind her, the pursuit was already mounting. And Pike, she knew, never gave up the chase. The old mare ran with everything she had, her hooves pounding against frozen earth, her breath coming in great steaming clouds. Clara clung to her mane, her legs burning from gripping so tight, her face stinging from the wind that cut like broken glass. Behind her, the alarm bell continued its relentless clanging, and she could hear men shouting orders, could hear the distinctive thunder of multiple horses being pushed into a gallop. They were coming fast, and they were coming angry. The land stretched out before her, vast, empty, treacherous in the darkness. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to see by, but also bright enough to be seen. Every shadow could hide a ravine, every rise could conceal a drop-off. Clara had no choice but to trust the mare's instincts and pray the old horse knew this terrain better than she did. A gunshot cracked through the night. The bullet didn't come close. It was a warning shot, meant to make her stop. Clara kicked harder instead, urging the mare faster even though she could feel the horse laboring beneath her. Feel the hitch in that left hind leg getting more pronounced with each stride. "You can do this," Clara whispered into the mare's ear. "Just get me to the foothills. That's all I ask." The mare's ears flicked back at her voice, and somehow, impossibly, she found a little more speed. Clara risked a glance over her shoulder. Torches blazed in the darkness behind her, at least 4 riders, maybe 5. They were still distant, but they were gaining. Their horses were young and strong, while hers was old and lame. It was only a matter of time before they caught up. She needed to reach cover, needed to reach the foothills where the terrain would favor escape over pursuit. According to James's map, it should be about 12 miles from Copper Creek to the line shack. She'd already covered maybe 2 miles, which meant 10 more to go. 10 miles. It might as well have been 100. The land began to change as she rode. The flat range gave way to rolling hills dotted with sage and juniper. The mare picked her way through, never slowing despite her injury, and Clara felt a surge of affection for the brave old horse, who was risking everything for a stranger's freedom. Another gunshot. Closer this time. Clara heard the bullet whine. Past her head, felt the mare flinch beneath her. "Stop running, girl," a voice bellowed across the darkness. "Not Pike, one of the guards. Make it easy on yourself." Clara didn't waste breath answering. She guided the mare down into a dry creek. Bed, using the banks for cover. The ground here was treacherous, studded with rocks and roots, but it would slow the pursuit as much as it slowed her. For several minutes, she rode in relative silence, hearing only the mare's labored breathing and the crunch of hooves unfrozen. Gravel, maybe she'd lost them. Maybe they'd a horse burst from the darkness ahead, cutting off her path. Clara yanked the mare to a stop so hard they nearly went down. The guard, a lean man named Carlson she'd seen at meals, blocked the creek. Bed with his mount, a rifle already leveled at her chest. "End of the line," he said, breathing hard. "Dismount." Slowly. Clara's mind raced. She couldn't go back. She wouldn't go back. She'd rather die here in this frozen creek bed than return to Copper Creek and face whatever punishment Pike had planned. "Lie." Sighed, "Dismount." Carlson's finger tightened on the trigger. Clara made her choice. She screamed and kicked the mare forward, straight at Carlson and his horse. The sudden charge startled both animals. Carson's horse reared, and in that moment of confusion, Clara's mare squeezed past, scrambling up the far bank of the creek. Bed. The rifle fired. Clara felt the heat of the bullet pass inches from her leg. But then they were clear, running again into the open darkness. "Pike!" Carlson's voice echoed behind her. "She's heading north-northwest." "I had her but his." Words were cut off by the thunder of more horses converging on the creek bed. Clara didn't look back. She leaned low over the mare's neck and prayed. The foothills were closer now. She could see them rising against the stars, dark and jagged and promising. If she could just reach them, if she could just find James. The mare stumbled. It was small, just a momentary hitch in her stride, but Clara felt it like a punch to the gut. The old injury was giving out. They'd pushed too hard, run too far on a leg that was never meant for this kind of punishment. "Please," Clara whispered, "just a little farther." But the mare was done. Even as Clara urged her on, the horse's pace slowed from a gallop to a canter, from a canter to a struggling trot. Behind them, the pursuit was closing fast. Clara could hear individual voices now, could hear Pike's distinctive roar cutting through the night. They weren't going to make it. The realization hit Clara like ice water. Even if the mare could keep running, they'd be caught within minutes. And when Pike got his hands on her, death would be a mercy compared to what would come first. She scanned the darkness desperately, looking for any option, any chance. And then she saw a cluster of boulders about 100 yards to her right, big enough to hide behind, defensible if it came to that. Clara steered the mare toward them, dismounting before the horse had fully stopped. Her legs nearly buckled when she hit the ground. She'd been riding so hard for so long that her muscles had locked up. "Go," she told the mare, slapping her hindquarters. "Get out of here." The old horse didn't need to be told twice. She limped away into the darkness, and Clara prayed she'd find somewhere safe to rest. The mare had earned that much. Clara squeezed between two large boulders, making herself as small as possible. From here, she had a view of the approaching riders but was hidden in deep shadow. She had no weapons, no plan, nothing but the desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, she might still escape. The riders appeared over a rise, 5 of them in a loose formation with Pike in the lead. Even at a distance, Clara could see his fury in the set of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse like violence incarnate. They slowed when they reached the spot where Clara had dismounted, circling, studying the ground. "Tracks go that way," one guard said, pointing in the direction the mare had fled. But Pike was already shaking his head. "She's too smart for that." She sent the horse away as a decoy. His head swiveled slowly, scanning the landscape. "She's here. Somewhere close." Clara's heart hammered so hard, she was sure they could hear it. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, barely breathing. "Spread out," Pike ordered. "Search every rock, every bush." She can't have gone far on foot. The men dismounted and began to move through the area, their torches casting wild, dancing shadows. They were methodical, efficient, working in a grid pattern that would eventually cover every inch of ground, including her hiding spot. Clara watched them come closer. 30 yards away, then 20, then 10. One guard, Carlson, the one she'd charged past, was heading straight for her boulder cluster. In another minute, he'd peer between the rocks and see her cowering. "They're like a rabbit in a trap." And then a voice cut through the darkness. A new voice. "That's far enough, boys." Everyone froze. Clara's breath caught in her throat. James Holloway sat on his horse at the top of the nearest rise, silhouetted against the stars. He held a rifle across his saddle, and even from a distance, Clara could see it was aimed directly at Pike. "Holloway," Pike said, and his voice was full of deadly promise. "Should have known you'd be behind this. You should have known a lot of things." James's voice was calm, almost conversational, but his rifle never wavered. "Like how I've been watching Copper Creek for 3 days. Like how I know exactly which of you has family, which of you has something to lose. Like how I'm a better shot than any man here, and at this range, I won't miss. There's 5 of us and 1 of you." "There were 5 of you," James corrected. "Now look behind you." Pike turned. On the opposite rise, another figure had appeared on horseback, Thomas Crawford, somehow mounted despite his injuries, also holding a rifle. "Thomas?" One of the guards saw it in disbelief. "You can barely walk." "I can shoot just fine, though," Thomas called back. "And I've got a lot of anger saved up from 3 months of healing. Who wants to test me?" The guards looked at each other, uncertainty rippling through them. They were hired men, not soldiers. This wasn't worth dying for. Pike saw it too, saw the moment he lost control. His face went dark with rage. "Stand down. All of you. I'll handle this myself." "No," James said quietly. "You won't. Because if you take 1 step toward those boulders where Clara is hiding, I'll put a bullet through your skull. And before your body hits the ground, Thomas will drop 2 more of your men. After that, the remaining 3 will have to decide if they want to die for Dalton's pride or go home to their families." Pike's hand moved toward his gun. "Don't," James warned. "I've been waiting for an excuse to kill you for 3 months. Don't give me one." The silence stretched out, tight as wire. Clara watched from her hiding place, afraid to breathe, afraid to hope. Finally, one of the guards, a older man Clara didn't know, spoke up. "I ain't dying for this, Pike. Dalton pays me to work cattle, not to get shot over a runaway." "Me neither," another said, already backing toward his horse. Pike's jaw worked like he was chewing gravel. But he was outnumbered and outgunned, and he knew it. "This isn't over, Holloway." Dalton will do nothing," James interrupted. "Because I have copies of his debt contracts, every illegal arrangement he's made for the last 5 years. If he comes after Clara, if he comes after any of us, those documents go to the federal marshal in Denver. Dalton will spend the rest of his life in prison, and Copper Creek will be auctioned off to pay restitution." Pike stared at him, and Clara saw understanding dawn. This wasn't just a rescue. James had planned this, had prepared for every contingency, had built leverage that would keep Dalton from pursuing them. "Now ride back to Copper Creek," James said. "Tell Dalton that Clara Bennett's debt is paid in full. And if I ever hear he's mistreated another worker, those documents get mailed. We clear?" Pike didn't answer, just wheeled his horse around and rode back toward the ranch. The other guards followed, leaving their torches scattered on the ground like fallen stars. When they were gone, James finally lowered his rifle. "Clara, you can come out now." She emerged from between the boulders on shaking legs. Thomas was all ready. Riding down from his position, moving carefully to spare his damaged body, James dismounted and crossed to her in 3 long strides. "Are you hurt?" Clara shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She'd been so certain she was going to die, so certain it was over. "It's okay," James said gently. "You're safe now, you're free." And then, finally, Clara's legs gave out. James caught her before she hit the ground, held her as 3 days of terror and 2 weeks of captivity finally broke through her iron control. She sobbed into his shoulder while he murmured quiet reassurances, and Thomas kept watch on the horizon, making sure Pike didn't change his mind. When Clara finally pulled herself together, she looked up at James's face, weathered and scarred, and more beautiful than anything she'd ever seen. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk everything for me?" "Because nobody should be property," James said simply. "And because I was tired of standing by while evil men did evil things. Seemed like it was time to do something good for once." Thomas rode closer, wincing. "We should get moving. Pike might come back with reinforcements, and I don't want to test our luck twice in one night." "Agreed." James helped Clara onto his horse, then swung up behind her. "The line shack is 2 miles from here. We'll rest there tonight, then head for Montana in the morning. There's a town there, Silver Ridge, where Dalton has no reach. You can start over." As they rode toward the foothills, Clara looked back one last time at the scattered torches on the ground, at the vast darkness that hid Copper Creek Ranch. She was free. Against all odds, against all reason, she was actually free, and the cowboy, who'd ridden through the night to undo the cruel bargain, rode beside her, his arms steady and sure, guiding her toward whatever came next. The line shack was exactly as James had described, a weathered structure tucked into the foothills, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The red cloth hung from the door like a beacon of hope, fluttering in the pre-dawn wind. James helped Clara down from the horse, and she stood for a moment on unsteady legs, staring at the simple building that represented everything she'd risked her life to reach. It wasn't much: rough timber walls, a sagging roof, a single window with oiled paper instead of glass. But it was a sanctuary. Thomas arrived moments later, his face gray with pain from the hard ride. James moved to help him dismount, but the older man waved him off with stubborn pride. "I managed to get up here on my own. I'll manage to get down too." Inside, the shack was spare but functional. A pot-bellied stove sat in one corner, a stack of firewood beside it. 2 bedrolls were laid out on the floor, and supplies lined makeshift shelves: dried beans, coffee, flour, salt. James had clearly been preparing for this moment. "Sit," James ordered, guiding Clara to one of the bedrolls. "You're shaking." "I'm fine," Clara protested, but her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely get the words out. The adrenaline was wearing off, and with it went the warmth that had sustained her through the escape. Now the December cold seeped into her bones like poison. James was already building a fire in the stove. Within minutes, warmth began to spread through the small space. Thomas pulled a flask from his coat and passed it to Clara. "Drink, it'll help with the shock." The whiskey burned going down, but it did help. Color started returning to Clara's vision, and the violent shaking subsided to occasional tremors. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked, looking between the two men. James fed another log into the stove before answering. Since the day I left Copper Creek, I couldn't save Margaret. She refused to leave, said Dalton would hunt her down and kill her for it. But I swore the next person he trapped, I'd get them out. He met Clara's eyes. Then I saw him at your uncle's farm, saw him draw up that contract, and I knew it was time to make good on that promise. The documents you mentioned, Clara said. The leverage against Dalton. Is it real? Every word. James pulled a leather satchel from beneath one of the supply shelves. Inside were dozens of papers, contracts, letters, ledgers. I spent 2 years working for Dalton. 2 years watching him trap people with debt, watching him forge documents, watching him bribe officials. The whole time I was copying everything I could find. Names, dates, amounts. Enough evidence to put him away for 20 years, maybe more. Thomas leaned against the wall, his damaged legs stretched out before him. Why didn't you turn him in before? Because I didn't have enough. Dalton has friends in Wyoming, judges, sheriffs, politicians who owe him favors. I needed ironclad proof. Enough that even his connections couldn't save him. James's jaw tightened. And I needed leverage to use against him, not just evidence to prosecute him. If I'd gone to the law directly, he would have found out and destroyed everything. This way, he knows I have the power to ruin him, and that keeps him from coming after. U.S. Clara studied the documents, seeing her own contract among them, signed in her uncle's shaky hand, binding her to 18 years of servitude. What happens now? Now we rest for a few hours, then we ride for Montana, James said. I have friends in Silver Ridge, people who owe me favors. They'll help you get settled, find work that's actually work and not slavery. What about the others? At Copper Creek, Ruth, Alice, Dorothea, all the people still trapped there? James's expression grew troubled. I want to save them all, Clara. God knows I do. But I can't force them to leave. They have to want it enough to risk everything, like you did. And even if they did, I don't have the resources to evacuate 15 people and hide them from Dalton. But you have evidence against him. You could shut the whole operation down. I could, James agreed, and maybe I will eventually. But that's a process. Investigations, trials, lawyers. It could take years. In the meantime, Dalton would know who exposed him, and he'd make sure anyone associated with that exposure paid the price. He moved closer, his voice gentle. Sometimes you can only save one person at a time. Today, that person was you. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to demand they ride back and liberate everyone. But she looked at Thomas's ruined legs, saw the exhaustion in James's eyes, and understood the truth. They'd given everything they had to save her. Asking for more would be asking for their deaths. I understand, she said quietly. But someday, when I'm stronger, when I have resources of my own, I'm going back for them. James smiled. I believe you will. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks gold and rose, the three of them sat around the stove drinking coffee and planning the next stage of the journey. Thomas would return to a small homestead he owned 30 miles east, far enough from Copper Creek that Dalton wouldn't bother him. James and Clara would ride north to Montana, traveling carefully to avoid pursuit. What will you tell Dalton when he asks about tonight? Clara asked Thomas. The older man's smile was grim. I'll tell him the truth, that James Holloway had him outgunned and outmaneuvered, and that Pike made the smart choice to retreat rather than get his men killed. Dalton will be furious, but he'll know his hands are tied. The documents James has will keep him from retaliating. What about my uncle? Clara asked, surprised to find she still cared, even after what Silas had done. Will Dalton go after him? The contract is void, James said, tapping the papers in his satchel. I have proof it was signed under duress, that the terms were illegal, and that Dalton used it to engage in human trafficking. If he tries to collect that debt again, I'll make sure the federal marshal knows about it. Your uncle is safe, though whether he deserves to be is another question. Clara thought of Uncle Silas standing in the doorway of the farmhouse, watching her be taken away without so much as a goodbye. Part of her hoped she'd never see him again. Another part, smaller and more forgiving, hoped he'd learn from this and become a better man. She doubted he would. By full daylight, Thomas was preparing to leave. He embraced James at the door, the two men holding each other with the fierce affection of soldiers who'd survived a battle together. "You did good, James," Thomas said. "Better than good. Couldn't have done it without you watching my back." Thomas turned to Clara next, and she was surprised when he pulled her into a hug as well. "You're braver than you know, girl. Braver than I was when my chance came. Use that courage wisely." "I will, and Thomas?" Clara pulled back to look at him. "Thank you for everything. Thank Margaret if you ever get the chance. She's the one who convinced me there was still good worth fighting for in this world." He limped to his horse, pulling himself into the saddle with visible effort. "Take care of each other, and Clara, don't waste your freedom. Make it count for something." They watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the vast landscape until he disappeared over a ridge. Then it was just Clara and James, standing in the doorway of the line shack as the sun climbed higher into a cloudless sky. "You ready?" James asked. Clara looked back at the mountains, at the direction where Copper Creek lay hidden in some distant valley. She thought of the women still trapped there, of the men breaking their bodies for a debt that would never be paid. She thought of her uncle, drinking alone in his farmhouse. She thought of Margaret Porter, locked in that silk prison. And then she thought of the road ahead, Montana, Silver Ridge, a life where she belonged to no one but herself. "I'm ready," she said. They saddled the horses and secured their supplies. James gave Clara a heavy coat that had belonged to him, far too big but warm enough to keep the mountain cold at bay. They filled canteens from the nearby creek and checked their provisions one last time. As they mounted up, James said, "I should tell you, the ride to Montana will take at least 4 days, maybe 5 if the weather turns. We'll be camping rough, staying off main roads. It won't be comfortable." "I've spent the last 15 years of my life uncomfortable," Clara replied. "A few more days won't kill me. Besides, I'll be free. That makes all the difference." They rode north, following game trails through the foothills, keeping to the high ground where they could see anyone approaching from miles away. The land was harsh and beautiful, endless sky, jagged peaks, valleys filled with pine and aspen. Clara had never traveled more than 10 miles from her uncle's farm in her entire life. Now the whole world stretched before her, vast and terrifying and full of possibility. That first day, they rode until dark, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Copper Creek. They made camp in a sheltered hollow, and James cooked beans over a small fire while Clara tended to the horses. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said as they ate. "Why did you stay at Copper Creek for 2 years if you knew what Dalton was doing?" James was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Same reason most people stay in bad situations. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I needed the money, that someone else would deal with it eventually. It wasn't until I saw what he did to Margaret that I realized there was no someone else. There was just me, and I had to decide what kind of man I wanted to be." He looked up at Clara. "I'm not proud of how long it took me to figure that out. But you figured it out. That's what matters. Maybe, or maybe I'm just trying to make up for lost time." They sat in companionable silence after that, watching the stars wheel overhead. Clara had spent so many nights trapped in small rooms, looking at walls instead of sky. Now there was nothing above her but infinite space, and she felt dizzy with the freedom of it. Over the next 3 days they traveled steadily north. James taught Clara how to read the land, how to find water, how to tell if they were being followed. They talked about their lives, Clara's childhood before her parents died. James's years as a ranch hand drifting from place to place. They didn't talk about the future much. It felt too fragile, too uncertain. On the fourth day, they crested a ridge and saw Silver Ridge spread out in the valley below, a proper town with a main street, a church, houses with painted shutters. It looked like civilization, like safety, like a place where a person could build a life. There it is, James said. Your new home, if you want it. Clara studied the town, her heart full of hope and fear in equal measure. What if Dalton finds me? What if he doesn't care about your evidence? Then I'll be here to stop him. James's voice was firm, certain. I didn't ride through the night to save you, just to abandon you now. If Dalton comes, he'll have to go through me first. Clara looked at him, this cowboy who'd risked everything for a stranger, who'd spent years gathering evidence against a powerful man, who'd refused to look away when it would have been easier to do nothing. Why? She asked. Why do all this? For me? James met her eyes, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Because when I saw you in that wagon, I saw every person I'd failed to help. Every time I'd stayed silent, every time I'd looked away. And I decided right then that I was done being that person. He paused. Also, you reminded me that there's still courage in the world that seemed worth fighting for. They rode down into Silver Ridge as the sun set, casting long shadows across the main street. People stopped to stare at the two riders, one a weathered cowboy with a scar on his jaw, the other a young woman in a coat 3 sizes too big. But no one looked at them with pity or suspicion. They just looked curious, welcoming. James led them to a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Catherine Foster, a woman with steel-gray hair and kind eyes who asked no questions. When James explained that Clara needed a room and a fresh start. We'll figure out the details, Mrs. Foster said, showing Clara to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. 4. Tonight, just rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to start building your new life. That night, Clara lay in a real bed for the first time in weeks, in a room with a lock that she controlled. Through the window, she could see the mountains in the distance, dark against the stars. Somewhere beyond them was Copper Creek Ranch, and beyond that, her uncle's farm. Her old life, already fading like a bad dream. She thought about Margaret, still trapped in that silk prison. About Ruth and Alice and Dorothea, waking up to another day of servitude. About all the people she couldn't save, and she made herself a promise. She would get stronger, build resources, make connections, and one day, when the time was right, she'd go back. Not for revenge, but for liberation. She'd finish what James had started. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Clara Bennett was free. She had a room of her own, food in her belly, and a future that belonged to her alone. It was more than enough. It was everything. As she drifted toward sleep, her last thought was of a cowboy riding through the night, refusing to give up, refusing to turn away. James Holloway had saved her life, but more than that, he'd reminded her that there were still good people in the world. People who believed freedom was worth fighting for. People who kept their promises, no matter the cost. And in the morning, when the sun rose over Silver Ridge, Clara would begin again, not as property, not as a debt to be paid, but as herself. Just herself. Finally, blessedly, completely free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.